Okay, so here's where we left off. Joseph Nietzsche has just died, right? Just after he's perfected his process, the photography process, he records the first image, view from the window at Le Gras, France. Now, unfortunately, he doesn't get all the fame that he deserves, but his partner, a man by the name of Jacques Daguerre, he gets the fame that probably should have been reserved for Nietzsche. But to Daguerre's credit, he actually takes Nietzsche's process and he makes it even better. He discovers that silver iodide is a more responsive substance than what Nietzsche had been using. And so his exposure times are cut down to minutes instead of the 8 hours that Nietzsche used. So he's able to get a photograph in minutes, like 8 to 10 minutes is kind of the average. Well, around 15, 8 to 15, I would say. So he's able to get a much shorter exposure time. And then his images are a lot more detailed than Nietzsche's was. Over the next few years, from 1826 up to about 1835 or so, Daguerre continues to perfect his process. In that time period, he takes probably his most famous photograph, which is this one right here. And this photograph is revolutionary for a different reason. Nietzsche takes the world's very first photograph, but Daguerre takes the world's very first photograph of, drumroll, a human. This is the first photograph ever taken of a human. Can you find the person in this photo? If you're having a hard time finding him, because it is a him, let me zoom in for you. That, my friends, right there is a man who was captured in this image. Now, if we go back, we zoom back out, I'm going to tell you a little something about this photograph. There's a lot of action going on in this street. There were probably carriages and horses drawing those carriages. There were probably people walking up and down the sidewalks, right? A lot of activity, a lot of action. But why were they not recorded in this image? Well, the answer is, remember we talked about exposure times. Exposure times were anywhere from like 8 to 15 minutes. No one was standing still long enough to be recorded on the image, right? If you think about even nowadays, if you try and take a photo and you move around too much, what happens? You go blurry, right? And that is a photograph that's taken in a fraction of a second. Imagine a photograph that took 15 minutes to take. If you're moving around, you're not blurring anymore. You've completely disappeared. And so that's what happened in this photograph. But this man, we know that he stood still for probably around 10 to 15 minutes because his image is captured. Now, he is a tiny bit blurry, but we know that he stood still long enough to have his photo captured. And historians say that what's happening right there is he's getting his shoes shined. This is a time where men wore leather boots, leather shoes, and it was considered, a social faux pas if you went anywhere with dusty shoes. So we know he was getting his shoes shined. So a pretty cool little historical fact there. By 1839, Daguerre perfects his process, and it's called the daguerreotype. He works on it for years and years and years, and he's ready to announce it to the world. He does, and it takes the world by storm. People are so amazed by this daguerreotype process and that they can get their photos recorded. Now, at the same time, another man, a man by the name of Henry Fox Talbot, who's also a scientist, like his other chemist friend, he perfects a different process called the calotype process. And now his process is a little different because instead of producing one image, his process produces a negative, and this is what a negative looks like. You'll notice that the tones of this image are reversed. Darks are lights, lights are darks. And from that negative, I'll show you another example. Right-hand side is the negative. Notice lights are darks, darks are lights. And then from that negative, this is a glass negative, from that negative, light passes through it, and then you are able to print the photograph onto a piece of paper. Okay, so again, this is called the calotype process, but his process was not as popular as the daguerreotype process for several reasons. Number one, it was a multi-step process, right? Instead of creating one image, you first have to create the negative, and then from the negative, you create the image. And that was like too many steps for people. Also, it was kind of like a clunky process. It was really hard to do. And on top of all of that, Talbot was kind of a grumpy guy. and he didn't want to share his process with the world. Daguerre makes his process free and gives it to everyone, right? His name is inscribed on the Eiffel Tower. Talbot wanted to make money off of this, right? Daguerre still made money, but Talbot wanted to make a lot of money. And so he wanted people to have to like pay him copyright laws whenever they used his process. So his process does not take off. But he is known as the father of modern photography because eventually people realize that the negative process is a better process than the daguerreotype process, okay? I'm going to pose this question. Why do you think that the calotype process, which is the one that Talbot invented that used the negatives, why do you think that process eventually became more popular than the daguerreotype? Normally we would have a discussion here. But since you're not in class with me, here's the reason. From a negative, you can print infinite amounts of photographs, right? You can make one for grandma, grandpa, your dog next door, okay? You can make as many photos as you want from this negative. You can also make it in many different sizes. You can lift the enlarger up to make the photograph bigger and bring the enlarger down to make the photograph smaller. So as long as you keep your negative safe, you can make as many photographs as you want. Whereas with a daguerreotype, it's one and done. It's one image. So if something happens to that image, if it gets burned down or the neighbor's dog eats it, it's gone forever, okay? So people realize, logically speaking, that this calotype process using the negative is the better process. And eventually the daguerreotype process, it's no longer around. I mean, there might be some historians out there that still know how to do it. But for the most part, we use the calotype process. We still use silver in our photographs when we print actual photographs from a negative. It's still, silver solutions are still used, and we still use the negative process today. If you were to take me as a second-year student and use the darkroom, you would create negatives using silver and develop them, and it's the calotype process. We just don't use glass anymore. Okay, so a couple more advancements. In 1840, the portrait lens is invented, and it makes exposure times go from minutes down to seconds, right? So 10-second exposures. That's in 1840. In 1851, a different process called the collodion process uses those paper negatives that we talked about rather than glass negatives, because glass negatives could break. So paper negatives are better. And these advancements make for more sharp images, right? And we use the word sharp to mean clear. You can see all the details, okay? So these are some major advancements in photography, okay? We're going to fast forward a little bit of time to the late 1800s when a man by the name of George Eastman comes onto the scene, okay? George Eastman revolutionizes photography again, right? You have Joseph Nietzsche, you have Daguerre, you have Talbot. All of these men create very major influential advancements in photography, and George Eastman is on the list in history as someone else who is super important to history in photography. So George Eastman, he starts a company called Kodak, okay, and Kodak is still around today. It's not as popular as it once was, but he creates a company called Kodak. Some people say that he named it Kodak because he liked the letter K. Some people say he named it Kodak because he says that was the noise that the shutter made when you push the shutter down on the camera. But anyways, it's a made-up name, okay? And George Eastman revolutionizes photography because he puts photography on a roll rather than a paper or plate negative, okay? So before, when you would take a photograph, you'd have to take your negative, right, with the silver solution on it. You'd place it down into your camera. You would take the photo, you'd then remove it from the camera. All of this done in the dark, remember, because you have to do this in the dark or else it would turn black, right, before you fix the image. So you would take it out of the camera, you would develop it, and then the next photograph, you would again put the plate in, take the photograph. So, right, it's a very long process. It's one at a time, and you have to load and unload your camera for every single photo that you take. This is a very clunky process. Eastman is like, how am I going to change this? So he puts negatives or film on a roll, so that now you can take anywhere from 30 to 50 to 100, depending on how big your roll of film is. You can take up to 100 photos before you ever have to take the film out. So imagine how much more efficient photography gets now that it's on a roll, okay? So the problem is with this is that it's super expensive. it costs $25 per roll of film to take photographs. So this means that this is reserved for professionals only or for the very wealthy, okay? And so what people would do was they would take their cameras with their roll of film. They would take all 100 photos, and then they would mail it to the George Eastman Kodak Company in upstate New York. It's where my mother-in-law is from. She lived in the town where this was done. And so upstate New York, they would develop your film. They would reload your camera with another roll of 100 photos. And then they would mail it back to you, your camera with the new roll of photos and all 100 of your photos that have been printed from those negatives, okay? Again, this is a very expensive process, so it's reserved for the wealthy, okay? This is what some of these rolls of film look like. You kind of see the progression. Those rolls in the back are older, and then as you move forward, they're a little bit newer. But this is what the package would look like that would come in the mail for you. Inside of it would have, notice on the bottom, 100 negatives. You would have 100 photographs on your roll of film, and then you would mail it all into them. They would print the photos for you, send the camera back with new film and all 100 photos, okay? But very, very, very expensive. Here's what a roll of film looks like once it's been unrolled. So George Eastman was not happy with this, with how expensive it was. He's like, I can make this even better, okay? And so around the turn of the century, about 1900, 1901, the brownie is introduced. And the brownie is, if you guys were here in my classroom today, I have an original brownie sitting in my desk. In fact, I could pull it out now. But the brownie was invented. And the brownie is super revolutionary because, remember, whereas before, to buy the original camera was $25, and then every time you sent it in to be reloaded with film, you'd pay $10. This guy right here, this brownie, cost $1. $1. Anyone can afford that, right? You, your mom, your dad, your grandpa, anyone can afford $1 at this time. And so this is huge because now photography is put into the hands of everybody, the average American. And now we see our photographic record, our historical record of photography totally changes from here on out. No longer do we just have, like the fancy seated family portrait of the wealthy. They'd go in, they'd get their portraits taken in their fancy clothes. No longer do we see just like the studio formal photographs. Now we see the day-to-day life of people. We see kids' first birthdays. We see a family picnic on Sunday down at the lake, right? We see what life looked like for the average American. And this is really, really the biggest advancement in photography, that now photography is for everybody. Now we all have these cameras that we take photos every single day, and it's all because of George Eastman and his revolutionary brownie. Now, photography doesn't stop there, right? It goes on. It's where my lecture is going to stop, but I ask you that once you are done watching this lecture, that you then go watch the History of Photography video. It's a great summary of everything we talked about, and then it picks up where we left off, and it brings it all the way up to today. I hope you all enjoyed that. Remember that you have a quiz to take on this. You can use your notes on the quiz. If you didn't take notes, I'd recommend going back and kind of looking at the major highlights of this, because you will be taking a quiz on your computer. Please type in your name where it says nickname. Give me your first and last name, because I will be recording your grade. You will be graded on this. So please take your quiz very seriously. Put your first and last name. Answer all, I think it's 10 to 12 questions. Try your hardest, use your notes, refer back to your notes if you need to. And yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And I will see and hear you all soon.